One of my subscribers sent me this video from a channel called Historexia, asking if nostalgia can be left-wing. Can people actually miss communism? So let's listen to some of the arguments and then talk about them.
So two spring to mind. One is nostalgia in ex-Soviet countries. So after the fall of the USSR, lots of places that had lived through state socialism and communism, and in lots of ways those societies were not pleasant places to live. They were totalitarian regimes, dictatorships, marked by a lot of want and uncertainty. And so you might think that, why would people be nostalgic for that? But actually, researchers have found that there's a lot of nostalgia for those sorts of pasts in.
So what I like is the thing that she believes people didn't like communism regime because of the totalitarianist aspect. I mean, throughout the history of mankind, most regimes were totalitarian. Especially here in Europe, we lived under kings, we lived under monarchy. Totalitarianism is actually the baseline for the human experience. And when communism comes up, you notice that there's also many regimes in Europe that are totalitarian. You have fascism, you have Nazism, you have communism. In fact, having democracies at those periods in time was the exception. No, the reason people hated communism, first of all, is the deaths and the atrocities that it did to one's nation. I mean, people were starving to death due to centralized planning, due to the government doing things like in China during the Great Leap Forward, they decided that the sparrow is a problem, that the sparrow eats the crops, and so by removing the sparrows, you're actually going to get more crops. I mean, it makes sense, but then you realize that, well, the sparrow actually eats insects, and now you have an invasion of locusts destroying your crops. They also wanted to compete with Great Britain into manufacturing steel, so every single peasant had a quota to fulfill, but by taking the peasants away from the fields and making them to produce steel, what ends up happening is that the crops rot on the fields, and you have the starvation. And then you have the Soviet Union with Lysenkoism, so you also end up with the idea that any type of genetics, it's a Nazi conspiracy, like the Nazis were high on genetics, and that's not scientifically proven. So any biologist, any doctor, any person that believed in genetics was fired, and people that didn't believe were promoted. So you end up with Lysenkoism, which was a pseudo-scientific thing, but it was promoted by the government, so it thrived in universities. Again, you get a famine. And not only do you get famines, but you get like this disgusting propaganda where people go home starving, and you get to see this imagery that's being presented that everyone is happy and everyone is cheering, and there's bountiful food. And people know that it's fake, but if you talk about it, if you actually say that this is not true, well, you can get fired from your job. It's not politically correct to say. They would call you a counter-revolutionary if you are pushing it too hard, like you're against the system, so you'd get punished for it. And this is why people hated communism mostly, right? It's the propaganda aspect. Like, it's one thing when the government fucks up and it ends up with famines and deaths, but it's another thing when they also force you to lie about it. Like, you see it happening around you, and if you try to talk about it, you're getting suppressed. And you're also afraid that your neighbor can rat on you, your kids can rat on you, like anyone can rat on you at any time. So you live in this constant fear that what you are doing is actually illegal and it can get you in trouble. But the lady does ask an interesting question. Why do people miss those times? Because it's true, like there are a lot of individuals who miss those times, and she calls this, can nostalgia be left-wing? But you're looking at this picture and it looks right-wing as fuck. In fact, if anyone would draw something like this, it would be labeled as a white nationalistic picture, right? Very little diversity, an emphasis on working out and being healthy and having a strong body. Very huge emphasis on the family community aspect. Like if you show this picture to someone, they would probably not even think that it's a communist regime that's being depicted here. They would think it's like some sort of American white supremacy picture. But okay, so there are many reasons why people miss communism. Some would call it Stockholm syndrome for a couple of individuals. Like, we know that people who live traumatic experiences and it's not good for them, there is some level of psychology where people will miss those experiences, even if they are horrifying. Like, there are victims that have been abducted and molested, and then they end up missing their captors, right? Like, this is the whole Stockholm syndrome phenomena. But in the case of communism, I would say it's more than that. First of all, you do have the people that actually did have it good under these regimes. And the author itself does go and talk about the fact that, well, people have friends, they have family. So they may not miss the regime itself. They may just be nostalgic after those times, right? Because you grew up under communism, you had friends then, and you had like all these pleasant memories. So you're nostalgic for the memories. You're not necessarily nostalgic for the regime, but you associate the two, and you think that you wouldn't be able to have had those memories if it wasn't for the regime, right? So like that's one group of people, the nostalgic ones. But then you also have like a group of people that were the freeloaders, like the group of people that were the leeches. The communists would even have a name for them. They would call them social parasites. But these were individuals that, for instance, would steal. And I know that sounds weird, but like under communism, that there were studies, at least in my country, showing that more than 80% of the population would steal. So why is that a thing? Like, how does that work? Well, most of it is because of the famines that I mentioned, right? So like the communists would keep people at the baseline of human existence. And you would notice that in order to survive, everyone around you was stealing stuff. So what does that mean? Well, if you go on a farm and you take stuff, no one complains. If you go in a store and you work at the store and you manage to take some items from the inventory, no one complains. And why is that? Why is no one complaining? Well, because you didn't have the concept of private property. So the property belonged to everybody. And if the property belonged to everybody, then, well, everybody could take it. That was the mentality. Now, of course, the government didn't like that, right? Like, the government didn't like the fact that stuff was missing from their inventories and stuff was missing from their stores. But how are they going to enforce it? Because at the end of the day, if you have, like, a supermarket and you're in charge of that supermarket and you know that your employees are taking stuff at home, well, they're not taking your stuff. They're not cutting into your losses. You're not actually getting into any trouble, because at the end of the day, you get paid the same regardless how much stuff you sell. So chances are you're probably taking some of that inventory at home as well. And you have like this entire mentality that, you know, like if no one owns anything, then anyone can take everything. So the people that live during those time periods where, again, like no one would have access to milk, or no one would have access to meat without a ration, and you happen to work at one of those stores as a cashier, and you have access to all the milk you want, you got access to all the meat you want because, you know, you work there and you can just take it home. Well, all of a sudden, you're going to miss those times when the gravy train ends and communism falls. Now, private property exists again, and you get fired from your store if you steal from the owner. And you can even get in legal trouble, right? So, like, those people are definitely going to hate it. And you have the power-hungry individuals. Like, there were individuals that back then realized that if they collaborate with the secret police, if they rat their neighbors, if they rat their family members, they get a lot of perks. They get sent into these places that were called shops. I know it sounds weird in English, but in Romania it was the English word, right? So, magazine, for instance, right? Like, they were sent into the magazine. And there they could have access to all the stuff that Westerners had. Like, they got access to Coca-Cola, they had access to expensive soap, packs of Kent cigarettes, like all that stuff that no one else had access to. And they got to feel very special. Why? Because they were ratting on their fellow man. They were reporting what their neighbors were doing, that they were listening to illegal radio stations, so on and so forth. So those people missed the communist times when they ended up failing, because all of a sudden, well, not only do they lose their social status and do they lose their ability to have stuff that other people don't? But they were also shunned by the rest of society. Most people were disgusted with these niches. And we even have laws that prevent the snitches from ever holding office again. If you are proven to have collaborated with the secret police during communism, then you can't hold office. So, yeah, those people would definitely have missed the communist times. And then there are the people that are born after communism and they just know the aesthetics, like this imagery that you've shown here and this imagery, right? And there's a lot of order that is being said. I mean, like all these kids, they wear all these uniforms. They were called the hawks of the nations, right? Like the patriotic hawks, I believe. Because when you went to school, it was very severe, very brutal, and you were constantly indoctrinated into loving your country, constantly indoctrinated into loving your leader. It wasn't an actual love, like you were forced. It was more like the country was raping you, if you will, because you had no choice but to love it if you wanted to graduate or if you didn't want to get your parents into trouble. So literally, like, again, you're in a nation that has famine, that has all this income disparity, all this poverty, and you notice that the people at the top are incredibly wealthy while average people are starving, and you're forced to love that nation, and you're forced to hold this truth that, well, actually, the nation is prosperous, everything is great, everything is amazing, there's no other better nation on earth. Experts say, scientists say that communism is the best economic system on earth, and if you don't say that, then you get your parents into trouble. And again, like, this was being drilled into your head from a very early age. And people look at the propaganda, people who didn't live through those times, they look at all this propaganda and they say, oh, well, things must have been that good. Like, I mean, people were genuinely living in bountiful places. And the best way to debunk the propaganda is to point out that if that was the case, why was the border closed? Like, the Soviet Union was one of the biggest prisons on earth, especially Romania. You weren't allowed to travel to Western nations. Like, literally, they would shoot you at the border. If you try to jump the border, and they do this even today in North Korea, like if someone tries to go from North Korea to South Korea, the border guards, they react violently to that. So if the nations are so amazing and so good, why were people prevented from leaving? Why was the human right of freedom of travel restricted? And you could leave, though. Like, from Romania, you could visit Russia. I think it was very difficult, but you could visit China as well. You weren't allowed to visit Great Britain. Unless you are the dear leader. Like, the dear leader did go and visit the United States. He did go and visit Great Britain, right? So, where is the equality that was promised by communism? How is this different than a monarchy, where you have, like, the inner party members, which are considered to be the new aristocracy, while everyone else is the peasantry, and they have to toil the land, and they're not allowed to leave from their noble's household? It's like, no. It was very similar to slavery, and I'm talking about the slavery from the medieval time period, where, you had the indentured servants and the peasants. It was very similar to that. And it didn't even create, like, social classes of people. I remember seeing a documentary where an inner party member wanted to marry a woman that came from a noble family. So before communism, she came from a family of nobility, and the communist ideology was that the nobility was oppressive, they were evil. And it was unfit for this party leader, which came from a good family of peasants and hardworking people, to marry a woman that's from nobility. So you just realize that it's the same ideology that existed in the medieval time period, only that is now perverted, it's reversed. But the wheel isn't broken. Like, it's still the same ideology that you shouldn't be able to marry who you want, you should look at their family lineage. And the communists would do this almost all the time, even when they hired people. They would look to see who your father was, they would look to see who your grandparents were. Was any of them counter-revolutionary? Did any of them belong to, like, a noble family and stuff? So like, this whole idea of equality was just window dressing. Like it was nice for the ideology, but in practice it didn't exist. And many people that are remembering communism today and they have this nostalgia, they may not even know about these things. Like, you gotta research them in order to see them, because most people alive today haven't lived through those times. But yeah, so I hope I did manage to give an accurate explanation on why some people are nostalgic. But to summarize, number one is the aesthetics, and they may not have lived through those times. Number two, they had it better because they were informants and they were ratting on their neighbors, so they didn't have to do much work. They didn't have to actually show that they're skilled or that they can overperform at their job. They would just be snitches and get high status in society. Then you had all the leeches, the people that didn't have a job, and when capitalism came, they couldn't justify why should they get paid for doing absolutely nothing, and they weren't able to steal anymore, so they didn't get jobs, and they were missing those times. And then you also have the nostalgia because people grew up during that time period, so they're more nostalgic over their friends, their relationships. It's not necessarily the regime. Let me know what you guys think, though, and as usual, I will see you in the comment section. Take care.